These are muscle cars, 400 cubic inches, horsepower to match, and enough torque to leave the competition in the dust. Welcome to the world of power and performance, not made for professional races, but for average drivers young and old, whose racetracks are the streets. Now, muscle cars on modern models.
To a muscle car owner, this is what it's all about. Putting together the magic combination of a powerful engine, carburetors in 2, 4, or even 6 packs, and just enough secret sauce in the head design to blow away any car that dared rev its engine at a stoplight. It's hard to believe, but in the early 60s, most of that muscle car magic could be bought right off the showroom floor. All of the big three, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, sold high-performance cars that ran like race cars and looked even better.
There's no other car quite like it. Ford Fairlane for 63.
A muscle car was greater than the sum of its parts. Sure, it had to have a very powerful V8 engine. It had to have an aggressive exterior. It had to have a wonderful, menacing exhaust tone. It just had to be in your face. If somebody questioned you, oftentimes it was the modern equivalent of the Old West shootout on Main Street at noon. You went out, you saw what your car did compared to somebody else's. That could settle a lot of arguments.
Ask 10 auto buffs what they consider the first muscle car, and you're likely to get 10 different answers. Ask what's the best muscle car, and you're likely to end up in the middle of a street brawl. Whatever the favorite, there's probably an example enjoying retirement at Floyd Garrett's Muscle Car Museum, just outside Knoxville, Tennessee. This is Muscle Car Mecca, drawing thousands from across the country to drool over 90 of the cleanest, shiniest, fastest automobiles to ever hit the streets. And yes, they all run. This engine is legendary, the Pontiac 389, similar to the one that would be placed in 1964 Pontiac GTOs. Thundering chunks of steel that many consider the first real muscle cars. But museum owner Floyd Garrett thinks the roots of muscle car design go back to the mid-50s, with cars like the 1955 Chrysler 300.
This is the famous hemispherical head engine, what they call the Chrysler Hemi engine, and it produced 300 horsepower, and that's where they started the 300 from. This car was really heavy for the NASCAR circuit, but you stretch it out on the long end, it would eat your peanut butter and jelly.
When it came to style and speed, Chevrolet was king in the late 50s. The famous 57 Chevys moved off dealer lots as fast as salesmen could do the paperwork. But the 58s broke new ground with a 348 cubic inch engine, 315 horsepower, that would lead the way to future high-performance power plants.
It was the first year for the big block engine, and this car is an unrestored car and a very rare car. It's one of fewer than 100 produced.
58 Chevys also upped the ante with Tri-Power, 3 dual-barrel carburetors, designed to suck in as much oxygen as possible to generate power and speed. With the big block engine and multiple carbs, cars came off assembly lines in the early 60s with muscle to burn. The race was on to see who could build the biggest engine with the most horsepower mounted in the lightest weight car.
This is a 1961 Ford Starliner. This was the first year for the multiple carburation on a Ford engine. It came out with 375 horsepower with a single 4-barrel.
The 61 Ford boasted a 390 cubic inch engine. By 1963, Ford was producing 427 cubic inch motors with horsepower as high as 425.
And the miraculous moment comes when the world's newest automobile springs to life under its own power.
Chrysler entered the muscle car race with its own strong Mopar Motor Parts Division competitors. Ultimately, a Dodge with a 426 cubic inch power plant and 425 horsepower.
In the early 60s, this was the ultimate factory drag car, period. Nothing could touch this when this came out. They all had dual quads, even the street Hemis. Look, a motor is basically an air pump. Air goes in here, goes out there, and the faster you can move that air, the better the motor. So with the Hemi heads, you got the plug in the middle, got the intake valve, exhaust valve. At, from 3 to 7 grand, the air is flowing so quickly and so perfectly through this motor that it was the perfect air pump, and which means it's a perfect muscle car motor. This is a pretty untouched car. It's a pretty big deal piece. You want to hear it?
While all of these engine wars were being waged among Chevy, Ford, and Chrysler, a quiet revolution was starting in the Pontiac division of General Motors. Bunky Knudsen took over Pontiac as general manager. He hired Pete Estes as chief engineer and a promising young designer named John DeLorean. Their goal was to change Pontiac's image dramatically.
The problem they had was they built a very old folks car, and as a consequence their audience was dying off. So the business was diminishing. There was zero excitement because those people didn't want excitement. And it was a pretty sad situation.
To get an image change off to a quick start, the trio of Knudsen, Estes, and DeLorean put together a couple high-performance engines that immediately caught the attention of muscle car buyers. Called Super Duties, they were available in 389 and 421 cubic inch configurations.
This is a 63 Catalina with a 421 Super Duty. Unlike the 61 389 Super Duty, there's of course bigger cubic inch displacement and had the 2 4s with the aluminum intake manifold. It was rated at a conservative 405 basic horsepower.
In the early 60s, car makers who wanted to sell their Super Duty high-performance street cars knew they had to put modified versions on the racetrack. There was no better way to sell a car than to have it win in front of thousands of race fans. The phrase, "win on Sunday, sell on Monday," became Detroit's mantra, and Pontiac's new Super Duties were winning big.
I think one year we won 49 out of 53 stock car races in the country, so it was a thing to generate excitement for the division and to bring it into a younger audience. And as a consequence, we did lose all the old people, but we did wind up with a, with the young, more affluent customer, which is exactly where you want to be in the car business.
Pontiac also added a design change that impressed young buyers.
I came up with a concept just sort of accidentally of widening the tread, so that led to the so-called wide track Pontiac. I think we widened the tread about 4 inches and brought the wheels out to the sides of the car, and all of a sudden the car took a new planted look. It looked like it belonged on the road, not like a guy with a hat on that was too big for him. It was incredible how that little thing made such a giant difference.
By 1963, Pontiac had joined the muscle car world as a major player. But a decision by General Motors management would shake up all of its divisions and have a major impact on muscle car design. When we return, the death of GM race cars and the birth of the legendary GTO.
The first drag strip, the Santa Ana Drags, began running on an airfield in Southern California in 1950. It gained popularity because of its revolutionary speed clocks. Modern marvels will return in a moment.
In 1963, General Motors faced a unique dilemma. Their divisions of Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile were too successful. Pontiac ad agency rep Jim Wangers found himself trying to sell fewer cars.
At that time, they were getting in the area of close to 55% of the market. And the government thought if you got anywhere close to 60, we're going to have to seriously look at you and figure out how we may break it up. So one of the things GM then, not as the industry, but as the corporate entity, the corporation, said, we're going to pull out of any active participation in motorsports.
No longer able to sell his cars on Monday that won on Sunday, John DeLorean went back to the drawing board, assessing who bought which GM cars and why.
The Oldsmobile guy was always the guy with the checkered pants and the white buck shoes and the Orlon sports jacket. The Buick guy was sort of a pot-bellied, semi-balding. I mean, these are the images you had in your mind. And then, of course, the Cadillac owner was the little gray-haired old lady. So you saw the person you wanted to appeal to, and we were looking for is the young, good-looking guy with a good job and, you know, making a decent living who liked a little excitement.
While other GM division managers conducted formal buyer surveys and pored over demographic statistics, John DeLorean spent his time researching what was happening in trend-setting California.
He was always out there looking to get information to form an opinion about what was going on so that when he marketed on target.
It wasn't long before DeLorean's research resulted in a new prototype. But it didn't come through GM's official design approval process. DeLorean did it his way.
I took a smaller car, a Tempest, and I had a big engine put in it, some aggressive tires. I bought a Hurst shifter out of a catalog somewhere, put a more aggressive suspension on it, and that was a car that I used driving back and forth to work. It was fun. And I'd lend it to somebody for the weekend. I'd say, here, you ought to drive this, and I could never get it back. So I said, well, I think there's a market there. And indeed, it proved to be true. It was just a car that everybody fell in love with the minute they got into it.
DeLorean decided to call his new car the GTO, Gran Turismo Homologado, a class of car designated by the Federation of International Automobiles, headquartered in France. At the time, the only other car designated GTO was the Ferrari.
It really was a tribute to Ferrari. We weren't trying to copy it. It was a tribute to them because they were clearly, and they still are, you know, the best of the best.
Jim Wangers was one of the chosen few to drive the prototype GTO.
This thing was just drunk with torque, and so all you had to do was just stab it a little bit, and you had instant tire smoke and instant, rear end squeal and howl, and all of the things that really were a major contributor to the image of what performance and what automotive excitement was all about.
Everybody was impressed with the GTO, except General Motors management. Suddenly, their flagship line, Chevrolet, had unexpected competition from within. Plus, the GTO violated a GM policy, allowing big, powerful engines to be placed only in expensive, full-size cars. DeLorean got around this restriction by offering the first GTOs not as specific models, but as high-end options on the midsize Pontiac Tempest. GM management told DeLorean that 1964 GTO production would be limited to a maximum of 5,000 cars, which had to be specially ordered by dealers. DeLorean and Wangers coaxed, cajoled, and begged dealers to order at least one of the GTOs. Within weeks, the cars rolled off delivery trucks across the country, and eager salesmen took them for a spin.
Now, these guys would come back and they'd say, holy smoke, what have we got here, And they'd run right into the sales manager or the dealer himself and say, hey, order 10 more of these because this is going to walk off our showroom floor, let me tell you. And they did. And so in a matter of less than a month after the cars began to show up actually in the showrooms, we had over 15,000 additional orders.
For GM executives, there was no turning back. Like it or not, they had a success on their hands. And the hottest GM car was no longer a Chevy, but a Pontiac.
By then, the egg had been broken and the omelet was made, so it really didn't make an awful lot of difference. See, then you had the market driving the product instead of us driving the product into the market. The public were demanding more cars than we could build.
Ironically, the decision to take General Motors cars out of professional racing was the best thing that could have happened to Pontiac. It forced creative engineers to take power reserved for the track and put it on the street.
See, the problem you had was that the guys that drove exciting cars were the chubby guys on Wall Street who didn't know how to drive. And the young people who really knew how to do it and got a shot out of it, got a high, couldn't afford them. Well, all of a sudden, you were putting a car in their hands that would run with about any car in the world at a very low price.
The Pontiac GTO, priced less than $3,000, would literally establish a new American subculture.
It was a production car. It just had a really good horsepower to weight ratio. And with a light rear end, you could light the tires up, and the tires in those days weren't as sticky as they are today, nor were they as wide. So, you could impress your friends pretty easy, and squirt around the corner and squeal the tires. They were just good streetable cars. They just happened to be fast, and they were affordable.
Street power was now in the hands of working men and women. Young drivers would spend endless hours tinkering under the hoods of their dream cars and cruising for a chance to show off their speed. When we return, the engineering and marketing savvy behind the GTO. And Chevrolet enters the muscle car game with the Chevelle SS Supersport.
Rhonda Hartman-Smith is the world's fastest mom. Rhonda is ranked number 10 in championship point standing of the National Hot Rod Association. She took the seat of her family-owned dragster in 1993 after her husband was injured in a race. Muscle cars will return in a moment.
At Floyd Garrett's Muscle Car Museum in Tennessee, only one car is displayed with its body stripped away to reveal the mechanics underneath. It's a Pontiac GTO.
Well, this is a good example of early GTO chassis, engine, drivetrain. Good depiction from the years of 64 to 67. The engine is a 389 with a standard 4-barrel, and the 389 being its last year in 1966. There were some slight differences between 64 and 65 with the head changes. And there was also some camming changes which just give it about 10 more horsepower. It has a standard Muncie 4-speed with the Hurst shifter, which the GTO is famous for, along with its white marble knob.
When designing the GTO, John DeLorean understood that a performance car was only as good as its manual gear shifter. He knew that standard GM shifters were not designed for racing. Again, bucking the desires of top GM management, he succeeded in placing a far superior shifter from an outside manufacturer in every GTO.
We have the two shifters here as examples of factory production and an aftermarket production unit produced by the George Hurst Company. The factory shifter would wear out easily, and it had no stops to keep you from pushing this shifter literally through the dashboard. The Hurst shifter, to the contrary, has a full perimeter box around the shift levers, and it very specifically has stops which are adjustable to allow a very positive, hard shift time after time after time.
Following their debut in 1964, the annual increase in sales of GTOs was staggering. Model year 1964 sold more than 30,000.
It happens every time. A guy goes out and gets a genuine Tiger, a Pontiac GTO that is, and guess who suddenly loves cats?
In 1965, Pontiac adopted a Tiger campaign for the GTO, with catchphrases like, "For the man who wouldn't mind racing a Tiger if someone would only put wheels on it." 87,000 GTOs were sold in 1965, and 96,000 in 1966.
GTO is really built for threading.
When you pulled into a gas station, for example, and you said, "Hey, check my oil," the gas station attendant, in those days you didn't pump your own, would come over and raise the hood, and then all of a sudden, holy smoke, look at that. And if there was a little crowd around in the gas station, they all come over and say, "Holy smoke, that looked good. Is that powerful? 3 carburetor." That was part of the charm and part of the sales.
The Tiger scores again. Pontiac GTO for 66, 6.5 liters of young Tiger.
To what did the GTO owe such sudden loyalty and fame? First and foremost, it was one hell of a car. Extremely powerful and beautifully styled. Some design elements, however, may have looked like they were added for higher performance. In reality, they were not.
GTO beefs up to 360 horsepower.
One of the things that has been a tremendous misconception over the years is that this does not produce any ramming effect. It is not a true ram air type of assembly. In fact, other than a styling pleasantry, this is absolutely the stupidest place to put a hood scoop on this entire hood. And Pontiac knew it at the time. They did it basically for styling. And the reason why that is so stupid is because the airflow comes off the front of the car over this nicely shaped hood. And the faster you go, the more the air goes up higher. So when you get in speeds 45 to 50 miles an hour, this is absolutely a vacuum. You're not getting anything in there but cooler temperatures. You're getting no airflow whatsoever.
For most GTO buyers, the fact that a hood scoop was non-functional was irrelevant. It looked really cool. Engineering designers recognized the value of image, and so did the GTO marketing team. With the dramatic success of the Pontiac GTO, managers of the General Motors Chevrolet division realized they too needed to attract the younger car buyer. In 1967, the Chevelle SS Supersport hit the mark, with V8 engines boasting 396 cubic inches and horsepower options of 325, 350, and even 375. The 67 SS put Chevrolet on the muscle car map. 63,000 Chevelles were sold in 1967.
Chevrolet, blue collar power, lots of power. The Chevelle was a good-looking intermediate body that could take the biggest engine that General Motors could build, and they had stout transmissions, good, robust drive lines. It could handle a real thrashing. The handling, again, and the braking was a little on the marginal side, but in a stoplight drag race with a properly set up Chevelle, it could give any other muscle car a real run for its money.
The General Motors Oldsmobile division also wanted into the Muscle Car Act. And so was born the 442. To distinguish itself from the GTO and Chevelle, Oldsmobile emphasized better balance in engineering in its muscle car. Unfortunately, that meant more weight and consequently less performance.
That's the demon of any race car, whether it's on the street or the strip. Weight is the enemy. Though the 442 had a little bit more of a luxurious bent to it than the GTO. That was the Oldsmobile tradition. Put a little bit of luxury in there as well as brute power.
Try as they might to compete with the GTO, when it came to muscle cars, the other GM divisions were continually playing catch-up to Pontiac in both performance and design.
If you look at most Pontiac cars, going back to the 64 Grand Prix cars, look at the interior appointments, look at the body appointments, look at the style wheels, they're always one step ahead of the rest of the GM lines. The other lines had their design engineers, which were very strong people, but they tended to walk the straight and narrow line, and John DeLorean did no such thing.
With glowing reviews and the youthful image of a Tiger ad campaign, the GTO remained supreme. Even when a GM chairman decided Tigers were not fitting for the company's reputation.
He snapped, so to speak. He finally said, "This is enough. I want this stopped. This is not an appropriate way for a General Motors division to portray itself."
Pontiac changed its GTO Tiger image to a more sophisticated one, based on 3 simple words.
This is the great one, the ultimate driving machine. And if you don't know what that means, you're excused.
We took the letters GTO and turned them around a little bit, and we called the car the Great One, or was TGO. And fortunately, it was successful. It worked. You know, the market realized we weren't being literate, but it was, in fact, the Great One. And so the GTO then became known as the Great One.
The Great One is bucket seats, carpeting, and a walnut-styled instrument panel. The Great One is Pontiac GTO for 1967. Isn't it time you decided to ride the wide-track winning streak?
Ride the wide-track winning streak. Ride the wide-track Pontiac.
Just as the power of the GTO appealed to men, its style appealed to women. No woman minded being seen behind the wheel of anything known as the Great One. But just as the sophisticated new ad campaign caught on, car buyers themselves came up with their own nickname.
The young people who had these cars, you know, they felt that what's the closest word that the letters GTO spell? And that was GOAT. For some reason, it came out of the marketplace, the owners themselves, and they began to nickname the car the GOAT. And it's even as popular today as it was when it first came into its own. A GTO is a GOAT.
Call it what you will, a GTO, a Tiger, the Great One, or even a GOAT. The Pontiac GTO became the muscle car to catch in the 1960s. When we return, the race is on to catch the GOAT.
Theories of where the term drag racing began are varied. Explanations range from a geographical location, a drag was a city's main street, to mechanical. To drag the gears meant to hold the transmission gear longer than normal. Modern marvels will return in a moment.
As engines roared at stoplights across the country during the late 1960s, no car manufacturer gave Pontiac better competition than Chrysler. Mopar put out a line of performance add-ons that had muscle car owners spending endless hours in their garages, getting every last bit of power and speed out of already awesome power plants under the hood. It may have taken the Chrysler lines of Dodge and Plymouth a few years to figure out what to put up against the GTO. But when they finally placed their own mid-sized muscle cars on the street, they were a force to be reckoned with.
Sheriff, I bought that car cash money.
You can't afford no car like this. These fancy Italian jobbies cost a fortune.
New Dodge Challenger coupe, Buford.
Challenger?
And it don't cost no fortune.
What? Look at the way this baby's built. Why, it's even got torsion bars.
Taking a cue from the Pontiac GTO, Dodges and Plymouths stressed price and performance with optional Hemi heads and carburetors and six-packs.
It's just 6 barrels. It's 3 Holly 2 barrels in line. You're basically running off the middle carb until you start putting your foot in it, and then the outer 4 come into play. And if you really put your foot in it and those outer 4 just slam open, you better be holding on, because I mean it's just it's violent.
For those muscle car lovers who didn't want to deal with the complexity of Hemi engines, Chrysler had another power player waiting in the wings, the Plymouth Roadrunner.
This is a 69.5 Roadrunner, 446 pack, and on the street these engines were rated at 390 horsepower, which a Hemi was 425. But unless you were one of the factory teams or somebody that could really tune up a Hemi, which was temperamental, these cars would pretty much eat a Hemi's lunch on the street.
What is that Fairlane feeling?
And what about Ford? What did it produce to compete with the GTO?
Some describe it as a noticeable quickening of the pulse.
The powerful Fairlane GTAs and Torinos were adapted from the racetrack for street use. Chuck Folger was a Ford engineer at the time when Fairlanes and GTOs raced head-to-head on the street.
We were very, very successful on the racetracks and the drag strips. We were a little bit, I think, slow in catching up with competition on the street. That was partially due to the availability of parts and getting the philosophy to where you could develop the car and run it down the production line.
Ultimately, Ford chose to compete for the young buyer with less powerful but very stylish pony cars. For drivers willing to sacrifice torque and speed for an eye-catching new design, Ford Mustangs filled the bill. Stock models couldn't come close to keeping up with the GTOs. In fact, very few Mustangs could really be considered performance cars. Those were modified by famous race car driver turned engineer Carroll Shelby.
This is a 68 Shelby KR convertible. The KR is king of the road. They came out April 1st, 68. It correlated with the 428 Cobra Jet announcement. I don't consider many Mustangs to be muscle cars, but this just happens to be one of them. This car is a complete and total muscle car. You put headers on this thing, and she will keep up with anything.
As the 60s came to a close, Pontiac's John DeLorean had one final trick up his sleeve to keep the GTO feeling fresh and powerful. In 1969, a new version rolled off the assembly line. DeLorean named it the Judge.
The name really came, there was a show on TV called Laugh-In, and one of the things that they had in every show was sometimes Sammy Davis, sometimes somebody else. It would always end with, "Here comes the Judge," and I thought that was sort of humorous. So I decided, well, we'll just call the car the Judge, so people can say, "Here comes the Judge."
Although the Judge was available in a variety of colors, its signature was carousel red, a very bright reddish-orange. This GTO was definitely a high-profile car, designed to be noticed. In true Pontiac form, however, the Judge continued to contain new innovations. Higher-end models boasted a redesigned form of ram air that could pump up performance.
Ram air was basically put an opening in the front of the car, it could be either in the hood or in the grille, in which the air pressure generated by the speed of the car would tend to supercharge the engine, and that's what the ram air was. And it gave a significant increase in power, but only at extremely high speeds.
The Judge would indeed mark the beginning of the end of the muscle car era. When we return, why high-performance cars stopped being made, and how modern muscle car lovers continue to keep the dream alive. In the lobby of Floyd Garrett's Muscle Car Museum in Tennessee, a bright red muscle car draws the attention of every visitor. For Floyd, it represents both a high point and the end of the muscle car era.
This is a 1970 Chevelle SS 454. It was the highest horsepower that ever come out of Detroit. It's 454 cubic inches, 450 horsepower. And it's got the cowl-inducted hood, the cold air package like you see on Ram Airs and shaker hoods on Mopars. This car is unusual because it's got an automatic transmission and it's got rear interior. This is as good as it ever got for Chevrolets in the muscle car era to me.
Shortly after the last 1970 Chevelles rolled off the assembly line, muscle cars began declining in popularity. The first sign of change came from insurance companies.
The insurance started to escalate, and pretty rapidly. They were cars that seemed to have a higher rate of accidents and a higher degree of damage than ordinary cars.
The gasoline shortage of the early 1970s suddenly made gas-guzzling muscle cars less appealing. Government regulations to eliminate leaded gasoline and reduce emissions further affected the market. As years passed, high-performance engines were still available, but they were no longer within reach of a working man's budget.
The difference was that the GTO was priced in a level at the, if a daddy wanted to do something nice for his son or daughter, he could buy him one to go to college with or for his last year of high school or whatever, because it wasn't a lot of money.
By the early 1970s, the only reasonably priced muscle cars were those sold on used car lots.
A 67 GTO, $1,525, ready to roll.
Those fortunate to have purchased and restored one of these bargains now have cars worth anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000. Those who sold their muscle cars for peanuts years ago not only missed out on the money, but the satisfaction of having a car they can actually fix.
I do miss the era. I miss the ability to pop the hood and pull the engine apart, put it back together, and turn the key, and it runs better than when I started. I miss not being able to do that with a new car.
Happily, however, for many true lovers of vintage muscle cars, the era has not ended. Drag strips across the country regularly hold events, allowing anyone with a mind to race to fly down a quarter-mile track. Street racing may be illegal, but there are many opportunities to test a car's performance in a safe, controlled environment. More significantly, the sport of performance racing seems to have attracted new generations of young people, many prompted by their parents.
It's a family thing. We actually got into it to keep my son out of trouble, and we do all of our own work. We totally restore our own cars, build our own engines.
It was a big thrill, going to school in my 66 Barracuda and stuff, all the kids, like, dang, that's a nice car, There's a real thrill out of it. I got, it was fun.
Picked up the car, had everything original in it, took it home, cleaned it up, dropped a new motor, transmission, differential, everything's brand new. Threw an airbag suspension setup on it, and it's been running ever since.
I just love automobiles, so it's I like to go fast too.
So I'm getting ready to do some upgrades on it, and I want to go faster. Hopefully I don't end up hurting the car, wrecking it, or doing something to it that it won't be around for another 20 years.
What continues to draw thousands of street racers every weekend to test their mettle? It may be the chance to race for the very first time, or to take on a friendly adversary who looks unbeatable. Of course, the price of winning may be popping a head gasket. Oops. Or blowing a piston.
Oh, you broke a rod?
I think it's a broken crank.
Many come to the drag strip simply because they still love the sounds.
The sound is an important part of what you do. I bought a record that somebody made way back then called The Sound of Speed, and it was nothing but engine noise. Put it on my hi-fi and listened to it by the hour. Man, it was so thrilling just to hear it.
To hear these powerful engines just bellowing out vast amounts of unburnt hydrocarbons. The tires just scrabbling for traction. The exhaust notes were they're music. To anyone that grew up in that era, that's the sound of our childhood.
John DeLorean still gets nostalgic when he watches his GTOs race. They remind him of a time when nothing was more important than creating objects of desire, fun, and excitement, affordable to the working man.
Those days, it was just so thrilling to do what you were doing. I couldn't wait to get to work. I can remember, maybe 30 times sleeping in the back of a car because I didn't have time to go home. I mean, it was incredible. You just, couldn't stop. You enjoyed doing what you were doing so much. It was thrilling.
In March 2002, General Motors announced that the legendary Pontiac GTO will soon return, styled along the lines of the Australian Holden Monaro Coupe. Today's automakers are definitely trying to recapture the magic of the muscle car era. Like Model Ts and even older vehicles, muscle cars from the 1960s and 70s make us recall an era when there were no computer chips under the hood, no LCD readouts on speedometers, and certainly no cell phones to distract us on the road. All that mattered was speed and performance. Just plain muscle.